Welcome to the latest episode of the Dribble Drive podcast. I am your host, Austin Render, along with co-host Dalton Shetler, joining you on Tuesday, January 28th, another week of Big Ten basketball in the books. Dalton, I feel like I need to say good morning because my mind is still wired on West Coast time. It's not 9 a.m., it is noon. Good afternoon, sir. How are you?
I'm doing good. And you, well, and I should say too, not that we want to get too far in the weeds of right that you're the voice of Indiana and I do Michigan State, but what time did you guys get back last night? You were at Washington last night.
We were back. We landed at about 5 o'clock, little before 5. I was in
Oh,
bed by 5:30. I think I got about 2 hours of sleep on the plane. Look, I get it. Flight attendants probably aren't supposed to sleep, but I was in like the second to last row. And so there's two flight attendants behind me, and they're just like yapping it up. And I'm like, come on, guys. It's like 3 in the morning. I'm trying to get some sleep here. Can you please stop talking to each other? I understand you probably can't sleep, but man, this is brutal.
right.
So
Oh, that's
yeah,
great.
it
Well,
was
look at you.
a
You're
look,
fresh and
red
ready to go
eyes.
now.
Exactly. I got about 5 hours of sleep. We're good. But I mean, red eyes are much better after you win. So happy that they got the win there. And we'll certainly talk about that game because it was something. We got a heck of a performance from Yarden Garzone. But let's talk. I think we should probably, let's do what we always do. Let's start with the top 25. My graphic is becoming a little bit too big now. At the beginning, when I created this graphic, we had 9 teams ranked. We only have 5 teams ranked now, but there are number 26, number 27, and number 28, all Big Ten teams: Michigan, Nebraska, and Minnesota right there. They all, Michigan and Minnesota, fall out of the rankings. Michigan with that loss to Michigan State, Minnesota with the loss to Michigan, and then Nebraska lost to Ohio State. So, not that any of them lost to anybody that they shouldn't have, but a week of more carnage in the Big Ten. I realized I did not switch that Maryland. I apologize. You can see the Maryland logo if you're watching with us on YouTube. It says Ohio State. That's actually Maryland. They dropped 6 spots. I'm a little sleepy this morning. Ohio State up 4 spots, and Michigan State a big jump up 5 spots, which we will absolutely talk about the Spartans. You know how we normally would have somebody come on and talk about their team. We're going to let Dalton do that for about 5 to 10 minutes today and talk about the Spartans because they absolutely deserve it. So that's where we stand. I appreciate, Dalton, I don't know about you. This is very minutia here, but I
Mhm.
appreciate the fact that UCLA is not dropping and isn't really even close to dropping. I think they got 31 of the 32 first place votes in the poll. I get it. South Carolina's red hot right now and probably has more quality wins, but I just think the head-to-head thumping that UCLA gave them has to matter, and the 20-0 has to matter, and I appreciate that the AP voters are keeping them that way.
Well, and I was gonna say because the head-to-head should matter, and the other part of it is UCLA hasn't stubbed their toe once. I mean, once they stub their toe, then it opens the door where you could start to hair split. But if they're perfect and they've got the head-to-head win over that number two, I'm with you. I'm with the voters. I think you keep them number one until they stub their toe, and then you can open up the conversation about how well South Carolina's playing.
Yeah, and UCLA, we'll start with them. But first, want to let you know we are on the Back Home Network YouTube channel live every Tuesday, usually at noon on the Back Home Network YouTube channel. You can join us live there, watch our videos after the fact as well. You can also catch us in podcast form on Apple and Spotify. If you are watching us live, feel free to comment and leave some questions for us. We will try and get to those as we go through the show. Let's start. UCLA, they're the number one team in the country. So let's start there. A
Mhm.
really emphatic win over Maryland, and a really nice second half performance from UCLA, 82-67. Lauren Betts was absolutely phenomenal and should absolutely be in the running for Big Ten and National Player of the Year. She puts up
Yep.
another 33 points in this game. My thing right now, Dalton, I thought, and I'm sure you felt the same, that the LA schools would be 1 and 2 in this league. I didn't think it would
Mhm.
be as unquestioned as it has been. I kind of thought it would be they're going to go on the road, somebody's going to trip them up. Not necessarily, and I know they haven't played Ohio State or the other LA school yet, But I still thought somebody, this is a deep league, this is a good league, somebody would trip them up on the road. And so far, UCLA's won at Washington, they've won at Indiana, they've won at Maryland, they've won at Rutgers, they've won at Purdue. They're just doing this so effortlessly, it feels like. And I know it's not effortless, but it looks it. And they haven't played a single digit game since the opener. So it's just really impressive what UCLA, and you could throw USC in there as well, but I think UCLA just, I've just been very amazed at how this has been so seamless for them, and they've avoided all the booby traps here through the first part of the Big Ten season.
I completely agree. And look, I do want to be honest here too for the audience. I'm experiencing a bit of a delay or lag. So if we end up stepping on each other, or if it gets bad, Austin, give me a wink and I'll switch over to my phone and see if that improves our quality. But back to the point of UCLA. I'm with you. And I think this win over Maryland was one of those where we sat there and we're like, let's see who. I think we're just kind of waiting for somebody to give them a run for their money. And I'm curious how it looks with Sellers on the floor, right? For the Terps, if she plays in that game against UCLA. Just like I'm curious about if she was there when they played against Ohio State, because I think Maryland deserves to be in this conversation. They deserve to be in this class. And without Sellers, it feels like you haven't really gotten to fully experience that. But back to UCLA, they're just a cut above. And USC, we know about the talent. We know about Juju Watkins. We know about Irief. And when I talked to somebody recently, though, who is another voice of a Big Ten women's basketball team who had the privilege, air quote, of playing UCLA already this season, they said, look, I've been around for a long time, couple decades. I've seen some of the great UConn teams. I've seen some of the best teams that college basketball has and seen us play against them. What this UCLA squad is right now is better than some of those teams he's seen go on to win a national championship, whether it was a UConn or whatever, when they got to play against him. He says they're just so deep. The pieces are all so complementary, so supplementary. And Lauren Betts is just an unstoppable force. And when you pair it all together, I mean, UCLA, I'm with you. I thought at some point, when you're talking about a conference that has maybe 12 teams talking about maybe making the big dance. Now, granted, a lot of them are living the bubble life, and they're going to live the bubble life for the next month and a half. But nonetheless, when you have that many quality teams, you figure there's losses to come somewhere. But UCLA has shown so far they're just a cut above.
They're going to play at Oregon, at USC, at Iowa, and at Wisconsin. Those are 4 remaining road games. They'll also host Ohio State, Minnesota, Michigan State, and USC. So there's still plenty of meat left on the bone for UCLA, but this was just a really impressive performance. Lauren Betts, like you said, is simply. I know that I think maybe it's voter fatigue, and it's not even voter fatigue because Juju Watkins has never won Big Ten Player of the Year. But I think everybody just kind of came into the year with it's Juju Watkins, and then it's everybody
For
else.
sure.
And Lauren Betts is, and I hate to keep making the comparison to Purdue last year, men's basketball, but they have a wonderfully talented big inside, and they surround her with lethal shooters and playmakers at the guard positions. And you have to figure out what you want to take away. Do you want to take away Kiki Rice and London Jones and the shooting ability of the guards? Or do you want to try and send 2 or 3 at Lauren Betts and try and slow her down? And it's an impossible question. I watched Indiana try and do it, and it's really hard.
Well, and the other part of it too that I don't think people talk enough about UCLA from watching them this year. It's the defensive end of the floor that really impresses me. I mean, and you laid out, you're absolutely right about what happens on the offensive floor and how it's such a conundrum for every opposing coach. But defensively, their ability to guard the yard in the approach, the tenacity they take with it on that side of the ball, like that almost ends up being more impressive than the offense, which again is a pretty high bar to talk about passing.
I think I said it after we played them that Lauren Betts impacts every play defensively. Whether she actually touches the ball or not, she is making an impact just by being in the game defensively, altering the minds of the guards, whether they don't feel like they can drive, they don't feel like they can take a shot when she's switched on them because she's so long. It is really something that I think has, like you said, gone very unnoticed. But I think also in the process of this, USC is going a little bit under the radar because they have
Yep.
that one loss, non-conference, to Notre Dame way back when. And I think we just don't talk about them as much because the top four in the country has stayed the same for the last 4, 5, 6 weeks here. And I don't know if you're with me on this, but I feel like anybody in the top four right now could be number one. You're looking at UCLA, South Carolina, Notre Dame, and USC. Then it's Texas, who we saw get blown out by South Carolina. It's UConn, who's lost to USC and Notre Dame. It's LSU, who we saw lose to South Carolina. So I think like the top four is a pretty definitive. These are your national title favorites. Not saying they're the only ones who can win it, but they are the favorites. And then after that, it just kind of becomes who else could potentially compete there at the top of the country. But USC, I think, getting a bit slept on. I think we lost Dalton on his computer. Yep, he's coming back. Here we go. We're going to bring him in. He's bringing in the phone. It worked last week. He's bringing in the phone. We're going to the bullpen.
That's exactly right. Well, and it's so funny too because I told you there was a lag, and I was like, it's only a matter of time, right? Maybe a hang on, but no. Okay. Hey, hopefully you weren't filling for too long, but I'm back.
No, I was just talking about the top four and how they're the favorites, I think, right now to win the national title, and two of those are Big Ten schools, which is fun.
I mean, it is preposterous. And it's funny, too, because, I mean, you mentioned USC maybe being under the radar, and it got a chuckle out of me because how in the world does Juju Watkins and USC end up under the radar? But it does have that kind of feel to it this year. And to your point, they lost to a really good Notre Dame team, which when they're healthy, Hidalgo, Miles, that's one of the more, besides just best teams in the country, it's one of the more fun teams to watch in the country. But USC's been able to handle everything. And I think maybe the reason why we unintentionally discount USC a little bit more than UCLA is we've seen a couple of games where USC hasn't quite had all the stuff at times, and they've had to put together stretches or runs to get ahead and win, where it feels like UCLA from the tip is already leading by 10 and stiff arms everybody, and sometimes will just stiff arm them into the ground throughout games. Like it's been 100% absolute domination from UCLA so far this season. USC is still a great team, obviously a top four team in the country, and unbelievably talented, but you've had to see them work for it in different stretches where UCLA hasn't. I guess that's why we unintentionally discount them, even though it shouldn't be a penalty.
Yeah, I think they've looked humaner at times.
Yeah.
That's a word that I'm going to make. I mean, in Indiana, they struggled. At Maryland, they struggled. But again, they won both of those games on the road in the Big Ten. Again, these teams are just winning like it's nothing on the road, which is incredible. February 13th, March 1st. Those are the two times we will get to see these two teams match up with each other, which is extremely exciting. All right, let's talk about the game of the week, in my opinion. Which involved Maryland as well, and this can be a further Maryland discourse, but I want to start with Ohio State. They win 74-66 over Maryland in a game that you and I were texting. I don't know about Ohio State. Like they're down big here early, trailed by as many as 15, and all of a sudden, what Ohio State can do is they can just flip that switch. And boom, here they go. 15-0 run in the third quarter. They get the lead. Jelani Cambridge was great. Kennedy Cambridge was great. They forced 17 Maryland turnovers. And just like that, when you thought Ohio State was in trouble, they weren't playing that well. You have to play 40 minutes against Ohio State. You have to handle that press for 40 minutes. And Maryland did it for about 20 to 25. And then Ohio State started to make its run.
Well, and it's interesting. I know the other team we're going to be talking about later on in the show is Michigan State, but a lot of times I'll couple Michigan State and Ohio State together because their play style is so similar, right? They're the two schools that really want to get out, full court press, and we're seeing it with Michigan State recently, where it feels like opposition is getting bogged down and worn down throughout the course of the game. And that's what happened in that Ohio State-Maryland game. They just simply wore Maryland down. Now, I made the point to you, and I said earlier, I'm curious with Cheyenne Sellers healthy and able to play, does she not become kind of the game breaker who kind of can break the press on her own? Because she has that kind of capability that would have been interesting to see. And you just felt like they got overwhelmed and rattled. Once Ohio State started to make the run, you could feel things tighten up. I don't know if Maryland got a good look on offense for 4 or 5 minutes for a while. They just weren't moving the same. Everything was kind of rattled. And the other big thing, too, if at least in the cons of the Terps, missing free throws. I mean, that game could have been in reach for Maryland had they made some free throws, couldn't get it done. And you talked about the tidal wave that Ohio State is. And you see when Cambridge is back, I mean, that's when they lost to Penn State, Cambridge wasn't on the floor. She was out for that game. I didn't get to see that game because we had one going at the same time. But she comes back, and you could immediately feel the presence, especially in that third quarter when that tidal wave started to shift everything there in Columbus. But, yeah, no, that was a huge turn of events for the Buckeyes.
Now, Ohio State forced Maryland into 17 turnovers. Maryland made just 5 of 19 from 3. Free throw struggles as well. Rebounding was where Maryland had the edge early. I mean, double-double for Christina Dulce with 18 rebounds in this game. I was listening to our colleague Matt doing the game for Ohio State, and he's like, grab a rebound. Somebody grab a rebound, because it was just like early in the game, Ohio State could not get a rebound. But eventually that turned into Ohio State taking the edge there in that third quarter. I think we might have lost Dalton again. Are you there, Dalton? Yeah, I think we lost him again. I'll talk to you all while Dalton gets his connection figured out. But another one for Ohio State this week was their win at Nebraska. They go 72-66 in Lincoln, a really difficult place to play, and Ohio State goes 2-0 this week. This was another game where it kind of felt like the tidal wave hit in the third quarter. It wasn't as drastic as it was against Maryland, but Taylor Theory goes for 23, knocks down 5 threes, double-double for Cody McMahon. They shoot 50% from the floor. And again, the third quarter, Ohio State shot nearly 70% from the floor, outscored Nebraska 25-17 in a really dominant performance for the Buckeyes on the road in Lincoln. So Ohio State now with those 2 wins is 8-1 of the conference, 19-1 overall. They're back up to number 8 in the AP poll. So there's absolutely no doubt that this Ohio State team, despite the loss, just a ginormous head scratcher to Penn State, they are right there in the thick of this thing. And they're going to have to go to LA next week. So we're going to talk about that on next week's show and play both USC and UCLA in a 3-day span. So that will be difficult. But if they could even grab just one of those, it totally changes the complexion of this Big Ten conference. And all right, let's see if we've got him now. He's back. We've gone to the bullpen again.
We're trying a different theory now. We're going hardwire in, so hopefully.
Okay.
Sorry as well.
That's okay. We're talking about this Ohio State-Nebraska game and how now Ohio State, I think we had our doubts after the Penn State game, like, what is this team? And here they are sitting at 8-1 of the conference with a really dominant week, beating both Maryland and at Nebraska. And now you look at not this week, but next week's games in LA, and you circle them big time and say this is an opportunity for Ohio State to contend for the Big Ten title.
Absolutely. And I mean, we talked about the LA schools. The big thing is going to be some of those matchups, right? Because you're going to have to knock off some of the best to make that happen. But I don't think, Austin, we ever really questioned the talent level of Ohio State. You just kind of sat there and you saw some of the games where they win by 4, they win by 5 against teams that aren't quite as talented, and you kind of wondered is something off there. Are they playing down to the level of their competition? What is it maybe? And you got to see in that tidal wave turn against Maryland that Ohio State was back. That second half was back. And then a big win against Nebraska, which, by the way, the Huskers not being involved still in that top 25, Austin, kind of stuns me at this point. I think the Huskers are going to eventually get their love, but I mean, they're 6-3 in the Big Ten. They got a quality win against Michigan State, which looks better every day at this point. And Nebraska, ultimately, like we've seen, they've kind of proved it. We maybe had some question marks about Nebraska, specifically after Natalie Potts suffered the injury. And you watched the Huskers kind of juggle around that 4 spot for a long time. You said, is there going to be an answer? Is there an answer somewhere in this roster? and they've started to be able to piece it together. Markowski and Prince are playing at a high level. Nebraska's looking really, really good. And again, 6-3 in the Big Ten is nothing to sneeze at, especially this year. But to your point about Ohio State, I think we've got them maybe comfortably in that top 4 once again, when maybe for at least the first half of that game against Maryland, we said maybe the basement's a little bit lower than that. Maybe it's 5 or 6, but I think they're comfortably in the top 4. And at this point, it's kind of hard to see them outside of the top 3, especially with the injuries to Maryland.
Yeah, if they can split in LA, they're going to have a chance to win the title. They have to get at least one win out west when they go there, which is difficult. You got to play 2 top 4 teams in the span of 3 days. On Nebraska, only one current ranked team left on their schedule. That's a road game at Maryland in mid-February. Outside of that, it's not easy. They still have to go to Indiana. They still have to go to Illinois. They host both Oregon and Washington, as well as Iowa and Michigan. But again, in terms of the top 25, the dominant teams in this league, they've already lost to USC and UCLA. Those are out of the way. They lost to Ohio State. I think they gotta get that Maryland game, though, if they want to be like truly top 4 in this league, because that's what you can't lose to all 4 of those teams and expect to be in the top 4. But again, they're not in any jeopardy of missing the tournament. They're not in any jeopardy of not getting at least a single bye in the Big Ten tournament. Nebraska is going to be just fine in a pretty favorable schedule. They got to come to the Hoosier State this week, though. 2 games against Purdue and Indiana, which will be interesting. I'm actually curious if they're coming for the whole week or if they're flying back and forth. I'm curious about that. We'll have to ask Matt about that when they come down to Bloomington on Sunday. All right, it's time to talk about the Spartans. Now that I think we've got our internet connection really good here for Dalton.
I think so.
The floor is yours, my friend. You have to try and take us through that second half against Michigan. That was something out of a fairy tale. They're down 4 at half, and Michigan State just goes on a run. And I couldn't watch the whole thing. It was hard. I was balancing trying to explore Seattle, but also when you're in Pacific time, these games are on like in the middle of the afternoon, and I'm like, gosh, it's 2:00. I want to go out and walk around and see things, but I also want to watch this Michigan State game. So take us through, just an unbelievable second half.
It was. Now, especially here too, to really set the context for this, like this is a good old fashioned rivalry. I don't know if anybody doesn't understand maybe what this game means. It's certainly, if you live within the Michigan border, you understand maybe most what this game means. But Michigan State, Michigan, whatever the sport is, this is a really big rivalry. So this is the 101st meeting all time between these two schools in women's basketball. The previous 100 meetings, Austin, they had never met ranked. This was the first time that both teams were ranked heading into the top 25. So there's all sorts of juice, right? Everybody's excited for this one. What's it going to be heading down the road to Ann Arbor? Michigan turns out a great crowd at the Chrysler Center. They have the 4th largest attendance in school history in the arena for this game, nearly 11,000. So it's loud, it's rambunctious, and that first half was simply stuck in mud, is kind of the way we put it. Like everything was just kind of stuck and just trying to get going. You get to halftime, it's 33-29, Michigan leads. The second half was, given the context of this being the rivalry game and all, it was, I described it earlier as a euphoric flurry. Like it was intoxicating. It just never let up. So Michigan State comes out on a 15-0 run out of the gates of halftime to take, at the time, what would be a 44-33 lead in the third quarter. They force a Michigan timeout. Then MSU goes on another 9-0 run, another Michigan timeout. And then there's another 8-0 run still to come in the fourth quarter. What Michigan State did, where they end up winning by 30, 88-58, it's the largest win at Michigan that has ever happened in the series for Michigan State to win at their place. It's the biggest win in like 18 years. And again, they were losing at halftime. And what you saw was Michigan State get back to the kind of basketball they love to play, where they force turnovers, they get out, they get some easy buckets. Theron Halleck was the game-high scorer with 25 points. 23 of those came in the second half. She had 25 points. Grace Van Sluten and Julia Arol each had 18 added up, that's 61 points from those three combined. That's more than the 58 Michigan had for the game. Michigan State's 59 points in the second half is more than the 58 that Michigan had for the ball game. It was, I did a couple of radio hits after this one, Austin, and I explained to somebody, I don't think I've ever seen the game played better. And I don't know that the game can be played better. And I feel like I've watched a lot of basketball. Granted, I'm not 70, 80 years old. I'm 30. I got the first 3 decades of experience between playing and watching. I've never, ever seen something like that second half was for Michigan State. They shot 62% from the field. They forced 13 Michigan turnovers. They shot 52% from three. I really don't believe the game of basketball can be played better than what that second half of Michigan State was. And it was a statement. And one of the big things too, Austin, I'll actually give you a turn to talk at some point because I got a lot of ammo here. I'm ready to go with this topic of conversation. Talking with Robin, that first half, Michigan won the 50-50 balls and got into the locker room. They made a couple of adjustments, but they also just challenged the players and said, hey, you know what this game's about. Julia Arold's from the state of Michigan. Theron Halleck's from the state of Michigan. The entire coaching staff, minus one member of like the 6 or 7 member staff, is from the state of Michigan. The other one's from Columbus, Ohio. They understand what this rivalry means. They understand what it means to be a Spartan, what this game means. And that second half, it was fueled by emotion like that. And it was simply unbelievable.
Look, it's your team. It's your game. I don't need to talk. This is you. This is all you. Because none of us were there. You were there. Are you still getting me okay, by the way?
I'm a little in and out, and I don't know what to do
No,
at this point.
it's me. It's me. I've got the Wi-Fi signal popping up on my screen now.
Okay.
So yeah, but that's why I'm going to turn it back to you. Like, what changed offensively in the second half? 61% shooting for Michigan State in that second half.
Robin Freilich had said after that one that the way Michigan was playing defensively on them created some spacing issues. They did some different things and help that really was kind of log jamming Michigan State. So they made a couple of adjustments to it, were able to get the spacing they desired. But the big thing too here to keep in mind is when Michigan State went to Nebraska, and it's funny, so we actually had the Robin Freilich show yesterday, and we talked about some of the things that Michigan State's really improved on here in recent games. And one of the big things she said, the team came back from the loss against Nebraska, and the staff, the players all got in the film room. They watched through some stuff. They talked it out, and they said, there's a level still that we are not reaching, and it's reachable for us. We're not playing to the best of our basketball. There's a level still for us to get to. So they've made some adjustments, especially on offense, where Theron Halleck now has exploded, right? She had 26 points at Illinois. It was a career high. She had 25 in the game to Michigan that we're talking about now. And she had 17 in the middle of that against Penn State. So Theron Halleck's game has exploded here recently, and a big part of it is they've moved her off the ball. They've switched up what she's doing a little bit, and now they're getting the best out of Theron because of it. And when Robin and the team came back and they said there's a level we could still get to after the loss to Nebraska, they took a hard look at that second quarter in Lincoln, where Nebraska outscored Michigan State 28-12 in that second quarter, and that's where the game was lost for Michigan State. I mean, they came back, made a great effort. It just was too big of a hole. And Dean Lockwood, who, of course, is in the Assistant Coaches Hall of Fame. He was with Pat Summitt for decades, and now he's been up here for a handful of years, and they kept him when he got here. Actually, a funny story about Dean, too, Austin, that I think listeners might enjoy. Robin Freilich's husband is Tim Freilich, and he played collegiate basketball, played for a little bit at Saginaw Valley State. When he was at Saginaw Valley State as a player, his head coach was Dean Lockwood. So when Robin comes in, and she's like, we already know Dean. We got to have Dean, given his great experience and resume, too. That was a really cool bit. But Dean went back and looked at that second quarter and said, that second quarter, we only averaged 2 passes per possession. Now, when they started to make that comeback, they were hitting 4 or 5 passes per possession. In that second half against Michigan, all the adjustments to spacing, everything else, they got the ball moving. And when the ball moves for Michigan State, they become really hard to guard. When they spread you out with Julia Arold, Theron Halleck, Grace Van Sluten, it's a lot to cover when that ball is moving. And Michigan State got right back to it in that second half against Michigan there.
It was impressive. It was thorough beat down for Michigan State. And it opens up the question, which we'll get into at the power rankings, of like, how high does Michigan State go here? I mean, what is the ceiling for this Michigan State team? And there's obviously a lot of season left. We're at the halfway point here. You have to go to LA later in February. Yep. But I mean, man, the sky is the limit right now for Michigan State. A really impressive win for them. Now 7-2, and as it would stand, as we just quickly throw this up here, they would be the 4 seed. Now again, we're only halfway there. There's a lot of carnage still left to be had in this league, but as it stands, they would be the 4 seed right now. Now Michigan State does not have the tiebreaker over Maryland. It does not have the tiebreaker over Nebraska, so that will be something to monitor down the stretch. Let's hit on a few games and teams we have not hit on yet, Dalton. A little bit more rapid fire here. Michigan, obviously, on the wrong end of that one, but a really good win for them earlier in the week. Just a crazy week for Michigan. They go and win at Minnesota 70-65. Silas Swords was really good in this one with 23. But again, just hard to get the taste out of your mouth of what happened to them against Michigan State, but you don't have to go back that far to see a really nice win for Michigan. And another team that it has 4 losses in the Big Ten, and they're all to top 20 teams in the country. They're the teams above them in the standings. They're beating everybody below them and equal to them. They just can't beat anybody above them right now. And so it's just hard to figure out what is the true Michigan team. And I think this is also part of when you run with so many freshmen, you're going to have some of these mood swings. You're going to have some of these like just random moments where, what was that? And then the random moments of, oh my goodness, that was incredible. Like, you're just going to get a lot of that from Michigan. And I think we saw that just in the span of about 5 days this week.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. I mean, that was a big win to go to Minneapolis and knock off the Gophers, who've been playing so well. And again, it's led by the freshmen. You mentioned Silas Swords. I mean, Silas Swords, Olivia Olson, Mila Holloway. It's a 3-headed freshman monster that they've got. And for anybody that's kind of missing on the context, again, this was the 8th best recruited class in the country that Michigan brought in this year. Olson and Swords are the 2 highest ranked recruits they've ever brought in. So they're ready to hand the wheel over to the freshmen, especially when they were a bit shocked at the end of last season when Layla Filia hit the transfer portal and went to Texas. Now, if you think about Michigan with Layla Filia this year, with these freshmen and Layla Filia, that would be a tough pill to swallow for the Michigan State fans, because that's a good team if they have a piece like Filia. But I mean, obviously she left, went to Texas, and now you're led by the freshmen who are uber talented. But I'm with you. I think there's some of these situations where freshmen are freshmen. I think maybe the best sign you can find is they're fearless. I mean, they went toe-to-toe with South Carolina out of the gates and pushed the Gamecocks down in that game. I think, to your point, these are just some of the ebbs and flows you take when you have such a young team. But no doubt about it, there's a lot of talent there.
The cupboard was pretty empty in terms of what was coming back for Michigan. And I know Jordan Hobbs, Greta Kampschrader were a part of that, and they've kind of coined themselves like there's a nickname that they gave themselves. Matt Parks said it on the pod. I don't remember what it was, but just like the very few returners they had coming back. And they've really rallied around those returners and the freshmen and have turned this into a really solid season just on the outside of the AP poll right now. All right, so unfortunately, Washington had a tough week because they were a get-right game for 2 teams that desperately needed wins. Let's start with Iowa. This is one of the best basketball performances that I have seen in some time. 72% from the floor for the whole game. That never happens. I mean, we just talked about Michigan State. They had a great half, shot almost 70% in the half. Iowa sustained it for the entire game. Lucy Olson didn't miss a shot in this game, and she's not known for her 3-point shooting, and she knocked down a bunch in this game. And Washington went on a 14-1 run in the fourth quarter, and it still ended up a 24-point game. This game was over so quickly, and for an Iowa team that had lost 5 straight games, it just felt like you were watching the Demons like be taken away from Iowa over a 40-minute span. Like, just boy, did they need that. Lucy Olsen hits 4 of 4 from 3, 20 points, 6 assists. Fierbach in double figures, O'Grady in double figures. Not only were they 72% from the floor, they were 69%, 9 of 13 from 3, led by as many as 36 in this game. On the road, you've lost 5 straight. Your NCAA tournament hopes are on life support, and you go into Alaska Airlines Arena, which cool arena, by the way. Really enjoyed our time there. But just a really impressive win for Iowa in a time where their backs were starting to not only be up against the wall, but they were starting to push through the drywall, and they needed to come up with something, and they did.
It's I think you said it right when it felt like all the demons were coming out for Iowa. It was an exorcism, it felt like. That it was all the frustrations boiled up because this is a team that you knew had what it took to win some of these games. They lose a 1-point game to Oregon the week prior. They have some of these games that are so close. They lose a 2-point game at Michigan State earlier in December. Like they had so much of this. And we talk about the talent. I mean, Stolke's still there, part of the national runner-up squad from a year ago, a huge piece of that. Lucy Olsen was an All-American at Villanova. You knew there was talent, and they were so close. And for just one day, it all just kind of expelled, and they took off. And you're right. I mean, 70-some%. I didn't get to watch this game, but I looked at the box score, and my jaw dropped. I almost dropped the phone. I mean, it was a ridiculously efficient performance. That was overdue for Iowa, and you just kind of felt like you didn't want to be the team that happened to whenever the Hawkeyes were coming up on your schedule.
Yeah, and it happened, unfortunately, to Washington. You mentioned their loss to Oregon, and the Ducks are playing some good basketball right now. They beat Indiana 54-47. I guess I should say they're playing some winning basketball. At times, it's not the prettiest thing to watch in the world, but I'm coining Eugene as where offenses go to die, because I believe if I look at my prep sheet here, I forget the exact number. It is now 11 straight opponents have shot under or have scored under their season average against Oregon. They do such a good job against you defensively. Kelly Graves has worked that system to a T, and they held Iowa to 49, coming back and winning that game with a fourth quarter surge. And then, as Chris Clayton told me after the game, their broadcaster, it was deja vu. They just did the same thing to Indiana. The Hoosiers go up 10 in the third quarter right out of the halftime break with a 7-0 run. And from there on in, they made Indiana's life very difficult. Hoosiers couldn't make anything. They were very physical with Indiana, going over every screen, fighting through every screen, making everything hard for the Hoosiers, who scored just 47 in this game. There's a definitive way Oregon has to win basketball games. They have to have low-scoring, grinded-out games. If you can score 65 to 70 points, you put a lot of pressure on Oregon offensively. But if Oregon keeps the pace low, they get a bunch of stops, they're right there, and they can beat a lot of teams in this league. And all of a sudden, you look at the standings, and you're like, okay, Oregon's 6-3 right now. I mean, this is not a team that had a ton of high expectations. They were similar to Maryland in the fact that there are a bunch of new transfers on this team. And Deja Kelly did almost nothing in this game. And Peyton Scott was really good. They got some contributions off the bench from some players that they did not expect to even play in the game. And that's what they have. They have a deep team. They have a really good defensive team. And when you make teams shoot 30% from the floor, you just have to make a couple of shots and you're going to pull it out.
Well, I was going to say deja vu. I wanted to make a Deja Kelly joke, but it just wasn't quite connecting all the way.
It was there.
Yeah, you're right. But, I mean, to your point about Oregon, they are stout. And what else is impressive? I mean, they're top 4 in the conference in scoring defense. They're also top 4 in steals. And you don't often see a group clamp down like that where they keep you low on the scoreboard. Normally, if it's that type of say, pack line defense where they really just want to shove everything in there and make life hell for you on offense, it normally isn't so much of a gamble in getting steals. Like, it's a really interesting dichotomy that they have on the defensive end of the floor. And you're right. I mean, that's how they have to win games. They beat Iowa 50-49. They beat Indiana 54-47. That's where they're comfortable. They're going to grind out wins.
Yep.
But so far, they're 15-5 and 6-3 in the Big Ten. It's time to put respect on the Ducks' name. They've earned it with some hard-fought wins in this league. And that sets up, I mean, a couple of teams we talked about recently. Thursday night, it'll be Oregon and Michigan State from the Breslin Center, and that one's going to be really interesting.
And Sunday they get Michigan. This is a huge trip for Oregon coming up this week. Peyton Scott is really good defensively. Now, Terry Morin said it, Indiana was a little careless and sloppy with the basketball, but there were a couple of just like, your standard dribble handoffs at the top in between the circles. Yeah. And all of a sudden Peyton Scott's there and steals it, and it's a pick six. And those are the ones that are just backbreakers. And she is relentless defensively.
And at the most important time that kept happening, Austin, where Indiana, I mean, it's a possession game within 2 or 3 minutes, and Oregon just kept finding ways to get steals.
Yeah, Indiana didn't score for almost 5 minutes for about the last 5.5 minutes of the game. They picked the wrong time to struggle to score there, because Oregon had multiple 4 to 5 minute scoring droughts. But when it mattered, Oregon got defense to offense down the stretch. Indiana does bounce back again. And sorry, Harry the Husky in Washington, because it happened at their expense again. They needed every single point on a career night from Yarden Gearzone. 35 points, 8 of 10 for 3. That's the second most made threes in an Indiana women's basketball history in a single game. She was unbelievable. I kept running out of words for every 3-pointer that she would make. I mean, one of her strengths, obviously she's a great shooter, but she's tall and can get shots over almost anybody. So you think you've got a contest, and she can still get the shot up, and she already has an extremely high arcing 3-point shot. So even if you have a hand in your face and you think you forced her to shoot it high, that's probably what she wanted to do anyway. And she was unconscious in this game, hitting some step backs, some step to the sides, got to her mid-range game really well. Missed one late that probably would have put the game away. They were up 3, 73-70, missed a shot that went in and out. And then we had a chaotic final sequence with Washington getting a look at a game-tying 3. But Indiana came out of half down 2. They scored just 8 points in the second quarter and then went for 30 in the third quarter, a lot of that from Yarden. And in the fourth quarter was just kind of a white knuckle hang on for dear life. But Sydney Parrish is playing some really good basketball right now. She has scored in double figures, I believe, in 8 of the 9 games since she returned from her knee injury. She had 16 in this game on 4 of 6 shooting from beyond the arc. Caroline Striplin's been in double figures in every game since she's been put into the starting lineup. So I think there are good things happening for Indiana. There's obviously still a lot they have to work out, and there was a lot of frustration. It's unique, and when you go out on one of these trips and you lose the front end, you are now on the road, having to practice in other people's facilities, staying in a hotel, and having to kind of have, like Terry Morin said, she was going to learn a lot about her team on how they would respond being away from home, their third straight loss in the front end of the trip to Oregon. They bounced back well. They had to hang on. Washington got a great look. I believe it was Steins that got the shot up at the end of the game that hit the back iron. But just a really good win and a much-needed one. Very similar to Iowa for Indiana. They needed to get a win, and now they come home for 2 games, Nebraska and Rutgers, the next couple in Simon Scott Assembly Hall. So an opportunity for Indiana to get kind of a little winning streak going here.
Well, and Austin, I hate to make it just a Yarden conversation, at least from my end, but I'd be interested in what else you have to say, because, I mean, even from when Yarden first stepped into the Big Ten, like, you just kind of looked at her size and her skill and said, oh, wow, this is a lengthy shooter with some real size and mobility to her. Like, this is a threat. And what she did in that game against Washington, it felt like that's something she's been capable of forever. And you kind of waited to see it kind of maximize potential like that. It feels like Yarden could do that I mean, look, 8 for 10 is kind of ridiculous from 3, but she could take over a game with her shooting like that anytime, it feels like.
Yes. And she went perfect against Iowa, 5 for 5, and another big road win. Indiana's won 4 Big Ten road games this season. And I know it's Penn State and it's Northwestern on some of them, but still, winning on the road in the Big Ten is not easy. And Indiana's done it 4 times already, so give them credit there. But I think one of my observations is the first 2 seasons for Yarden, she was almost strictly a spot-up shooter. And she would do a little bit of ball handling last year, but even like her freshman year, it's obviously Grace Berger who's running the show. Last year, it's mainly Chloe running the show. And so that allows her to kind of work off of, in the past, Mackenzie Holmes inside, kick it out, 3 balls for Gersone. Well, this year, they've put her on the ball a little bit more within the half-court offense. I think she's had more on her plate, and I think at times it's worn her down with the physicality the defenses have played against her. I think about Illinois, I think about Oregon, 2 games where she really struggled. Defenses were very physical with her. I thought last night Indiana played her more off the ball. They put her in more sets that got her open looks for 3. And I think that's going to be something that they might stick with moving forward. I'm curious to talk to Coach Moore about it because it felt like there was a concerted effort of let's let our guards run the show in terms of Chesky and Moore McNeil and Bargesser, and let's let Parrish and Gersone get some sets run for them. They were a combined 12 of 16 from 3, those 2. So you get them good looks. More often than not, they're going to knock them down. This was the best 3-point shooting night of the season for Indiana at 57%. They did it against the Big Ten's leading 3-point shooting team in Washington, who shot just 29%. So Indiana, just kind of a cathartic win, one that you really needed. It was a lot of fun. I know it got tight late, but it makes that red eye home a lot more enjoyable when you can sleep on a win and you're not thinking about the loss. One more game, just real quick. Shout out to Rutgers, get their first Big Ten win over Penn State, 77-73, and that's important because that's one of those wins against teams you're fighting with at the bottom of the conference right now. Let's look at those standings here. That win by Rutgers now puts them in a position where they are the 15th seed and would be in Indianapolis if the season ended today. Again, they still have 8 more games left in the conference schedule. A lot can happen, but that's a big win to have the head-to-head tiebreaker over Penn State, who I believe they will play again. I believe that's their 2 play. So we will see those 2 teams match up again in Piscataway. But that's your standings right now. A reminder that the top 9 get a bye. The top 4 get a double bye, and 10 through 15 will duel it out. I believe I have these situated by tiebreakers. I tried my hardest.
Okay.
I believe if it were to end today, USC has a win over Oregon that UCLA does not. That's the highest opponent in the standings, that there's a difference between the 2 teams. So I believe that it goes to USC. Obviously, they're going to play twice. We're going to figure more of this out later. Maryland and Nebraska, when you have more than 2 teams tied, you take their record in that group of teams. So Maryland has beaten Minnesota. Nebraska has beaten Minnesota. So they're both 1-0 in that group. Oregon hasn't played any of them yet. And then Minnesota is 0-2 in that group. So they dropped to the 8th seed there. Same with Illinois. They've beaten Indiana. Indiana lost Illinois. Michigan hasn't played either one of them yet. So that's where those 3 kind of settle out. But so much. And you hear me say some of these middle teams haven't played any of these other middle teams. So we're going to see so much of this change. Oregon plays Michigan and Michigan State this week. Indiana plays Nebraska. Illinois plays Maryland. So much of this is going to change, obviously, just in the next week. But certainly by the time we get to the season finales that first weekend of March, it's going to be fascinating to see how these standings change over the next couple of weeks.
And we're virtually at this point at the halfway point of the Big Ten season. I mean, a lot of teams are 9 games down, 9 to go. And so it's going to be fun to watch on this back half. I did want to mention real quick, Austin, the bottom of the Big Ten standings. Number 18 is Rutgers. I believe that's supposed to be Purdue. Right?
That is supposed to be Purdue. I apologize.
Yeah. No. I didn't want to. I wasn't calling out for that. But just So listeners, so yeah, I know red eye. But just so the listeners knew, that's Purdue at the bottom. So Purdue,
Yes.
Northwestern, Penn State would be missing as of now.
Yes, and Northwestern still, and this is going to be where it gets tricky again. We talked about it, I think, last week. The Big Ten's going to have to figure out what they're doing with Northwestern and the LA schools because they had games that were supposed to be played that ultimately got postponed. Obviously, the wildfires take much more precedent over anything when it comes to sports, and our prayers are with everybody impacted by that. But the Big Ten does have to figure out what they're going to do with that. All right, power ranking time. Not a whole lot different. Again, we always text. We don't look at each other's that much. But I do think we aim to be different. We weren't that different this week. Oregon and Michigan, we flip-flopped in the 8-9, and I think I had Oregon at 8 at one point, and I flipped them back. So that was our only difference.
And
Indiana,
I saw you. I don't mean to interrupt. I saw you had Michigan at 8 and Oregon at 9. And I was like, I got to be. I mean, they're kind of 50-50 to me. I was like, I got to be a little bit different here.
Well, we're going to find out on Sunday when they play each other in Ann Arbor where they stand. But then I think your 10, 11, 12, 13 is in some order. You've got Indiana, you've got Iowa, you've got Washington, and who am I missing? Minnesota.
Too. Minnesota,
so
yes.
I think you're probably looking at Indiana or Minnesota in that 10 and 11, Washington, Iowa in 12, 13, somewhere in that range.
Okay.
I don't think that, and I'm biased, but I don't think Indiana is that far away from jumping in. But again, it was like last week where I had Illinois at 9 and Indiana had just lost to Illinois. So you can't really justify putting them in. And this week I've got Oregon at 9. Indiana just lost to Oregon. So you can't really justify putting them in. But if Indiana wins on Sunday at home against Nebraska, that's a really nice win. Puts them at 6-4 in the conference. Maybe we can have that conversation. But Michigan has a big week this week, I think, because you get Oregon, another team who you're jostling for position with down in the middle of the Big Ten. They also go to Wisconsin on Wednesday, a game that they should win on paper, but we have seen crazier things happen to the Big Ten. So I think an important week for Michigan, who has taken care of business in games like Wisconsin all season long so far. So we'll see if they can do that again. I will be honest, I contemplated switching 4 and 5, but I think we've talked about it a lot. I think the Cheyenne Sellers injury, if I knew that was a season ender, I would flip them.
You know what? I agree with you there, Austin.
If I knew this was what Maryland is going to look like from here on in, that's not to say they're a bad team, but it's to say, okay, this is the version of Maryland we're going to get. It's not the version of Maryland that beat Michigan State.
Yep.
And Michigan State's playing some great basketball right now. But because I know that Cheyenne Sellers is going to come back at some point, they list her day-to-day with a knee sprain. I think it's fair to say to give Maryland just a bit longer. I would say if they lose this week at home to Illinois, then we can have a conversation about it. They're at Penn State Wednesday. They're home to Illinois on Sunday. If they go 2-0, they can maintain their spot there at number 4. But I think if they lose, we can start having that conversation. But just wanted to throw that out. I think Nebraska's earned their spot there. I think every week we talk about where the drop-offs are. I think it's 1 and 2, and even Ohio State pretty firmly at 3. Drop off there. And then I think there is a bit of a drop off after 6. I don't know if you agree with me there. And I don't think it's a drop off to where it's not like UCLA to Nebraska. It's like Illinois could beat Nebraska. Absolutely. I have no doubts about that. But I think resume and body of work, Nebraska's only losses this season are to the 3 teams at the top of the standings. So I think that they have earned themselves that 6. Illinois absolutely could beat them. I'm not saying they can't. It just does feel like there's a bit of okay, I'm good with the top 6. Now what do I do with 7 through 9?
Well, and I agree. And that's what it's funny. I mean, we're talking about how the rankings weren't very different between you and I, Austin. And I mean, how do you not put UCLA 1, right? And you and I both agreed the 2 LAs should be the top 2. And then given Maryland's recent stretch, especially with the Sellers injury, Ohio State also earned a win head-to-head over them. They're comfortable at 3. Maryland's we could talk about maybe Maryland, Michigan State, how things play out, but as of now, this feels right. Nebraska has earned to be there. After that, I see a difference as well. I think Illinois is maybe the most comfortable out of that next tier so far because Illinois earned some big wins in the middle of that pack. The win at Indiana they had recently, and they've put a couple together in a row since they lost to Michigan State. And I said last week, don't penalize Illinois so much for the loss to Michigan State. It's a bad matchup. Just like Nebraska's a bad matchup for Michigan State. I mean, there's a bit of a cycle you could play with bad matchups in this league where teams are chasing other teams around. But Illinois feels right at 7. And then from 8 through 13, just kind of depends how things play out. Like that feels like that could shift at any given moment.
Yeah, every week.
Throughout the next couple weeks.
We could be talking about Iowa jumping into this if they beat USC. I mean,
Yeah.
let's talk about the schedule coming up here because there's no like top 25 versus top 25 on the schedule this week. But my game of the week, simply because of what all the hullabaloo that it will be, is in Iowa City Sunday, number 4 USC at Iowa. It's the Caitlin Clark jersey retirement game. It's not 1-1 by any means, but when Washington retired Kelsey Plum, they put on a show and beat Purdue. I'm not saying that equates to Iowa over USC, but that there will certainly be a lot of energy at Carver Hawkeye Arena on Sunday. So that feels like an opportunity for Iowa to be like, hey, we're still here. We're still Iowa. And also kind of firm up their spot in the NCAA tournament. What else stands out to you, Dalton, on a week that, again, doesn't have that like definitive headliner, but I think has a lot of intriguing matchups?
Well, and I think you got a couple of games in the middle that are really interesting. One, I think, is your neck of the woods, Nebraska at Indiana coming up this weekend. That's an interesting one because what Indiana can do with, say, Chloe Moore McNeil defensively on Britt Prince. Can you neutralize that effort a little bit? Can you make it more about Markowski inside? I think there's some interesting matchups and storylines to go with that. If Sellers isn't back by the weekend, Illinois at Maryland, I think, is a really enticing matchup to take place there in College Park. And then Maryland, I mean, like you and I were talking about, Austin, they could, if they drop that, then we're having maybe a different conversation about, okay, without Sellers, what is Maryland? How much do we penalize all this if they're down 4 or 5 losses in a row? And the Oregon swing to the Mitten State. I think it's going to be an interesting game against Michigan State. Can they find a way to stifle the Spartans, which offensively had it going a little bit? And that Oregon-Michigan game, I think, is going to be really, really interesting. And I think that's really, in some facets, a battle for 8, like we both were looking at our power rankings. And if Oregon comes out of the Mitten State with 1 or 2 wins, I mean, we're talking about them pretty healthily in the top half of the league.
Yeah, and I think a tough week for Minnesota and Washington. Huskies have to go to Ohio State. Minnesota has to go to LA. If they could somehow pull out a win, that's season changing for either one of those teams. But 2 teams that right now have both fallen out of our top 9 in terms of the power rankings, and it's only getting tougher. That's life in the Big Ten right now. Sunday's an absolute juggernaut of a day. You see that 7 of the games on this schedule are on Sunday. Wisconsin-Purdue's worth shouting out because the Boilermakers need a Big Ten win. That could be an opportunity for them to get it there. Bracketology was released this morning by Charlie Kareem on ESPN, actually within the last hour or so. Big Ten, again, is putting up their tents on the bubble. They have permanent residents. Actually, not even tents anymore. They've started to make them Airbnbs.
Condos.
Condos. Indiana has moved down into the last 4 byes, basically switching spots with Oregon. Oregon is now up to the 9 line, which is where Indiana was. So Indiana, Illinois, and Minnesota are still receiving byes, along with Harvard. Hoosiers know them very well. And then the last 4 in is Iowa, Iowa State, a team that Iowa beat this year, Virginia Tech, another team that Iowa beat this year, and Washington, another team that Iowa beat this year. Maybe that's what Charlie was doing there. He used the tiebreaker to put Iowa ahead of all 3 of them. But Washington is the last team in. Iowa's in that last 4 in, and then Indiana, Illinois, and Minnesota are still biting their nails a little bit. and could use some more wins. Opportunity on the road this week for Illinois and Minnesota, at home for Indiana. It's going to be really fascinating to see where this Big Ten season goes because, like you said, 13 teams in the field, but 5 of them, almost every single bracketology, 5 of them are on the cliff, hanging on, trying to make sure they make it. Charlie Cream told us when we had him on in the summer that he would come on in February. I will be attempting to make that happen, so hopefully we can have a special Dribble Drive episode. Probably not a Tuesday. We'll probably do it whenever he's free and post it. But hopefully we will be able to get a special edition Dribble Drive bracketology with Charlie Cream because the Big Ten needs to be talked about in bracketology right now.
Completely agreed.
Well, Dalton, thanks so much for doing this. Both of us battling internet issues. Shout out to our internet providers. We're not going to name them, but we need better. I upgraded my internet when I started this podcast, and here it is bucking its head back at me. Thank you all for
coming adversity.
Thank you all for listening. We've had quite a few people coming in and out of the live stream. We appreciate you joining us. For those of you listening after the fact, give us a like, a subscribe, download, whatever the kids say to do at this point with podcasts. Give us a rating. That kind of stuff helps us as well. Looking forward to another great week of Big Ten basketball. It's going to be a ton of fun to watch as we see more games in the Big Ten. And I say more clarity, but we're probably not going to get any more clarity when it comes to the Big Ten standings. It's only becoming more and more muddled. For Dalton Shetler, I'm Austin Renner. Thanks so much for spending your Tuesday afternoon or whenever you listen to this with us. We'll be back next week.